The whole pupil view is an approach to assessment that puts the pupil at the centre. This combined approach poses and answers several questions for each and every student. Our assessments support this whole pupil view by offering you timely, rigorous ways of assessing your students in different areas that can contribute to your judgment of each student. That is, when looking for data, this is typically to seek answers to key questions to help enable you to make fully informed decisions for your classes and your students. At the heart of the whole pupil view is your judgment, the teacher judgment. You know your students well, and the data from GL assessments is there to support this judgment, enabling you to make fully formed decisions. Here is Daisy Christodoulou exploring, comparing and contrasting teacher judgment with standardised assessment data.
So I think a fascinating thing to do when you're looking at standardised test data is to compare the standardised score to the pupil's most recent teacher assessment. And typically what we find is maybe 85–90% of the time there's a really close agreement. And then what's fascinating is maybe 10% of the time there isn't. So there's a group of pupils for whom the teacher assessment is slightly different from the standard test assessment. And for some cases the teacher assessment have been more generous, in some cases less generous. So then you can just dig into that and think, why is that? And it's not about saying, well, the teacher assessment must be wrong, or the teacher assessment must be right. It's about looking at it and saying, why might that be? And you find all kinds of fascinating reasons why might that be. Some very obvious, to do with maybe pupils' attendance or something about they've been missing chunks of time in class, and that's why they didn't do well on a teacher assessment. But sometimes it sparks some new questions, and it leads to teachers following up and thinking, well, why is that? So I think in some ways the best use of the standardised tests is not to provide answers, but to generate questions. And if they generate really good questions, you can go off and investigate. That can be really powerful.
What is their ability? What are their attainment levels? Are there any barriers to learning? First, let's look at ability. We see our role as working with you as an assessment partner. We support your ongoing assessments with more formal assessments that enable comparison of students to national benchmarks through the standard age score. This is very difficult to do by any other means. This is where the cognitive abilities test fits in. Our assessments provide you with consistent data, whether looking at attainment, barriers to learning, or in this case, ability. How powerful would it be to get insight into the capabilities of a particular student? This will help validate your view as to whether you think a student is underperforming, performing as expected, or indeed are they performing above expectation. Ability is not an easy area in which to gain objective insights. Here, Carol Holmes from West Horton High School discusses how CAT4 gave the school an insight into underperformance, which led the school to look in more detail at potential barriers to learning.
I can think of an example of a child that's been helped. If I think about a young girl who came through our school a couple of years ago, who was showing a lot of enthusiasm in the classroom, and we thought she was performing well. Actually, when we looked more closely at her CAT4 scores, it became clear that linguistically she wasn't performing as well as she should have been. And that led us to consider a dyslexia test. We would have had great difficulty in sourcing that dyslexia test. It's quite difficult in the current climate to access tests from an external provider because of budget constraints. We were able to administer a test internally that identified for us that child was struggling, and we were able to put dyslexia support in place for her, and that really allowed her to make progress through our school.
Our cognitive abilities test can help you gain these insights. CAT analyses 4 aspects of ability and produces a clear profile of each. Next, let's look at attainment. Our aim is to help you ensure that each student makes the best progress he or she can. You'll have many different sources of information to help build this view, such as how they work in school, their attendance, how they behave, and so on. In addition to these observations, you may also test students with your own assessments, either directly related to the work they have just completed, or perhaps at the end of a term. Many schools use our progress tests year on year, enabling them to compare and contrast student performance. Our assessments are tailored to particular year groups, which provides you with a very measured approach that can be carried out once a year, so that you're looking at the same aspects of students' development each year. Through our rigorous approach to research, we work with large samples of students upon which to base our data. We therefore offer unparalleled statistical analysis. This can be supported by the interrelation of attainment, ability, and barriers to learning data. You can also compare attainment across different assessments. For example, a student's performance in English and maths, science and maths, English, maths and reading, and so on. Do students perform at the same level in these different areas? Or do they have strengths in particular areas? The information provided by these attainment data can help you review the impact of teaching and learning, and thus inform your planning of next steps for each student. Our attainment tests enable annual formative or summative testing in English as well as reading, maths and science. These enable you to see what students can do at a particular point in the year. Usually, this would be towards the end of the year, so that you can identify any gaps in the student's learning. This can inform the next teacher in the coming year. From a formative perspective, attainment test reports also provide you with rich narrative information about individual students and groups of students that can guide your planning in a formative way. Now, let's look at the insight that can be gained by comparing ability with attainment. Looking at ability and attainment separately helps to support and guide teaching and learning. However, even greater insight can be derived by comparing a student's ability with attainment results to see if a student is achieving their potential in a curriculum subject. Sometimes these students are hard to spot and go under the radar.
If you look at the research on this, then there's lots of research that shows that children often from low-income backgrounds, children from ethnic minority backgrounds, children with SEN, that often they can be, sometimes the teacher assessment can be biased against them, and tests can help. Actually, it seems unlikely, but tests can actually show that those people's sort of true ability and what they really can do, and the test actually can be less biased than the teacher assessment. Of course, those kind of tests, they're not a replacement for teacher assessment. I think the way I've sort of used them is to use them in conjunction with teacher assessment, and as I say, to just give you an extra bit of information and to help flag up, as I say, any issues you might have missed.
For many students, the CAT results come back and look sensible. That is what you might have expected based upon their attainment. Just as often, there will be a minority within the group that suddenly appear to have a profile that shows they are more capable than the teacher first thought. CAT4 can help quantify those abilities that underpin academic success and potential. Without a measure of ability and potential, information about attainment would be missing valuable context. So far, we've seen that our whole pupil view promotes ability and attainment assessment to enable current achievement to be contextualised against potential. Now we come to barriers to learning. If students aren't achieving their potential, this begs the questions: why? What's stopping them? Why is there a gap between a student's attainment and their potential? Are there any barriers to learning, and if so, what are they? You'll want to know what barriers are holding students back. Here, Matthew Pitts discusses identifying discrepancies between performance and ability at his school, and how this informs decision-making around teaching and learning.
So the GL assessment tests have allowed us to really inform our groupings in the classroom. They're very practical in their use. And so we use things like the CAT tests, the dyslexia, the dyscalculia screeners, even the PASS, the perceptions and attitudes tests to inform our groupings, rather than going for almost a traditional low, middle and high approach. It's very useful for me as a teacher because it tells me why a child is performing the way they are in the classroom, and probably more importantly, what their potential actually is. So if I look at the case of a child that's perhaps not performing so well academically, but then I look at their CAT score and they have a very high quantitative score, it tells me that actually they should be doing quite well in maths. And then if they're not, I can look into why. I can then look at the perceptions and attitudes and look at perhaps what they believe about learning and about themselves as a learner. And it tells me whether a child is really achieving their potential, or whether actually with some extra support, with some mentoring, they could actually achieve more, or whether they're achieving all that they can and they're working as hard as they possibly can. So our groupings are informed not just by current attainment, but by potential barriers to learning, and also and it also allows me to remove some of those barriers and to make sure that children are achieving their actual potential.
One assessment that can provide real insight into barriers to learning is the PASS survey, Pupils' Attitude to Self and School. This requires the students to complete an objective survey on themselves as learners. How they feel about themselves, how they feel about the place they're learning in, how they feel about the people that they're learning with and from. PASS may uncover reasons why a student is not performing well in the classroom. In the context of ability, CAT data, together with attainment data, this may well be significant and help identify the keys to unlocking underlying potential, such as what's getting in the way of this student fulfilling their potential. There may be things happening outside of school. There may be things happening within school. Other potential barriers to learning that require investigation might focus on whether a student has a special educational need or disability. Here is Carol Holmes from West Horton High School explaining how her school uses the concept of the whole pupil view.
The whole pupil view is one of the reasons that we're particularly fond of this package of assessments. You see, we don't see assessments as an end in themselves. Assessments provide a set of data that we can use as teachers and we can use as school leaders, but they tell a story. And the more information you have about our children, the better the story will be. So we're able then to put together the different elements of what a child is. So we can see what their attainment is. We can identify barriers to learning. So for example, dyslexia, dyscalculia, we can identify reading as a barrier. And we can also look very importantly at a child's attitude to school and how well they view education and how much they value it. And we think that's going to give us the chance to intervene early before attitudes set in. So this package gives us the whole picture of a child sitting alongside our own judgment and sitting alongside what we know about our children, and that's important too.
So, to summarise, our whole pupil view philosophy has interrelated elements, but the most important point is that it puts the student at the centre. Central to this is everything that you already know about your students, informing your judgment. This can be supported by the interrelation of attainment, ability, and barriers to learning data. Each individual aspect is important in understanding what a student is achieving, what their potential might be, and what barriers to learning are preventing the student reaching their potential. The power of this philosophy is in combining all of these to provide a well-informed whole pupil view. The better the student is understood, the better placed you are to provide the most appropriate teaching and learning to help them maximise their potential. Let's leave the final word on combining all of the data available to you to provide the whole pupil view to Matthew Pitts.
So in one Year 6 class that we had a child that came in. He had very high CAT scores, and he had clearly got a lot of cognitive ability, and he was coming in with relatively low academic outcomes, even in maths, which was his strong point. And so we dug into why that was. He didn't have dyscalculia, he didn't have any of those barriers, but we looked into his perceptions and attitudes to staff and school test, the PASS test, and we discovered that actually his perception of himself as a learner, and also his perception of learning was particularly undermined at the time, and his confidence levels were very low. And so by working with him on that, by grouping effectively and ensuring that there was sufficient reinforcement for him, he then went on to make really good progress across the curriculum in Year 6.